by the end of daylight savings time, it feels like it's like way too early to be this dark, but luckily our speaker today is from Sweden, so he's quite used to. It's dark all the time. So, but this is Los Angeles and the land of sunshine. Speaking of the land of sunshine, this is the inaugural fall Design Media Arts lecture, and we are incredibly lucky to have Patrik Svensson start us off this year with a talk, Aspirational Humanities for Makers and Thinkers, and he's going to be giving about a 40-minute talk followed by a short discussion with me. I'm Peter Lunenfeld, a professor in Design Media Arts. And then we are going to open it up for a dialogue, which I'm hoping that people will want to participate in. And also just be aware, this is being live streamed and will be archived. So when we do our Q&A, we'll be passing a mic around, not because we can't hear you, but we want to make sure that the live stream also gets your comments. So I've been privileged to know Patrik for many years. He is a central figure in the global discourse and dialogue about digital humanities and the intersection of different forms of knowledge making. He's a scholar, a writer, a curator, and an entrepreneur. His current work is on conditions of knowledge production, emerging forms of humanities, infrastructure, and mobilizing critical knowledge to collaboratively respond to societal challenges and complex problems. As a practitioner, he is committed to building generous, sharp, and deeply collaborative institutions and platforms. And I think one of the things I'd love to talk about in the Q&A is what are our thoughts on institutions right now when institutions are under mortal attack? Svensson Patrik recently published Humane Infrastructures with MIT Press. It came out this year. And that builds on a collaboration that he actually did here at UCLA, including a large workshop called Humane Infrastructures that was held in March 2020, together with Arizona State University, which is where he's headed next. He's been in a deep dialogue with Arizona State's President Michael Crow, a really interesting innovator in the higher ed space. ASU and Malmo co-organized a series of events earlier this year on Critical-Connective Tissue, Making Worlds with the Humanities. He was previously director of the HUMla, that's where I first got to know him, and professor of humanities and information technologies at Umeå University in Sweden. He was a visiting professor of digital humanities here at UCLA from 2016 to 2020, and has held fellowships at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies. Again, I'm just delighted to be able to introduce Patrik Svensson, and can we please have a round of applause?
The longer the introduction, the older you are, I think. Let me just pull up my... Thank you very much, Peter, Design Media Arts, Digital Humanities, and Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. I think it's a wonderful triangulation of sponsoring organizations, and I'm really happy to be here again. This was home for 4 years, and still is, it feels like, when coming back. So although the title zeroes in on the humanities, this topic is very much about the interface between different types of critical knowledge, practices, and the university and the world, especially in the context of aspiring to make things better. So one definition of aspire I found actually in the concordance, I'm a linguist, concordance tool I'm using, is have an ambitious plan or lofty goal. But looking into this more closely, I think it's a crossword kind of definition. Merriam-Webster says to seek, to attain, or accomplish a particular goal. So here are some examples of what I call aspirational humanities. And it should be noted that there's an element of institution speak here. I think what Peter called feel-good BS in an email, written to promote whatever work you're doing or planning to do, but still important and meaningful to look at, a space for articulating where you want to go and what you aspire to. And these are also particular sources, of course. But let me just go through these very quickly. So plant humanities, dealing with issues of profound public concern, addressing challenges like biodiversity loss and food security. Ice humanities tackles the existential crisis posed by the planet's diminishing ice reserves and stresses the centrality of ice in human and non-human life. Energy humanities. The next steps in addressing the environmental crisis will have to come from the humanities and social sciences. This is really aspirational. The task is nothing, and I'm quoting, the task is nothing less than to reimagine modernity, and in the process to figure ourselves as different kinds of beings than the ones who have built a civilization on the promises, intensities, and fantasies of a particularly dirty, destructive form of energy. Environmental humanities aims to place, and this is from a journal, place the environmental humanities at the center of conversations about our ecological futures. So this quote is from Resilience, which is a journal of environmental humanities, which actually interestingly changed its name a couple of years ago to Resistance, a journal of radical environmental humanities. And the rationale is as follows. While resilience pertains to the ability to endure stressors and return to a prior state, resistance is about taking action to challenge and change the conditions that lead to crises. And finally, urban humanities, of course, a big thing here at UCLA too, have always been invested in speculative practices that imagine the possibility of a more just, more equitable future. So they talk about, in this book, bringing the city into the university and the university into the city. Indeed, they say, we speculate about a future embedded in the present where these spaces that have long been set up in opposition overlap, eventually becoming one and the same. So the aspiring humanities is a place for tackling crises, imagining ecological futures, reimagining the city and modernism, among other things. So I wanted to say a few words about where I'm coming from and why I'm interested in this topic and sort of setting the stage too. So I used to run a humanities tech lab, HUMla at Umeå University, a meeting place for technology, culture, and the humanities. And here we negotiated the role of the humanities in relation to information technology, which led to an interest in digital humanities. At this point in time, digital humanities was sort of being formed under that name. It was called humanities computing earlier. There's a complex genealogy here, but something like that. So we weren't really DH, but we were interested in the potential moving forward, especially in relation to intellectually and critically driven technology. In fact, wanting to influence and change DH. So this inspired an approach based on critique and interpretation as one tool for imagining what could be built in a kind of integrated fashion, and then actually build it, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And this was also connected to creative practice. And we had an artistic leader employed, for example, an artist. And projects included things like, and this practice included things like alternative screen and interaction environments, as you can see here in some of the pictures, faceted browsing concept as a way of navigating European archival materials, kids making the narratives for opera performances performed by professionals in the opera house downtown. So typically working with others within the university and outside. And later, and this is the personal story too, later after I'd moved to the US, I became more interested in humanistic work in a broader context, not just to do with knowledge production. That's a big deal in itself, but with challenges and problems in the world. And I spent a year at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and the very first seminar we had at my center was by Naomi Murakawa, who's now at Princeton, I think. African American Studies, and she spoke about procedural justice in police practice. And packed room, people outside that couldn't see her, couldn't see the screen. Vigorous dialogue afterwards, lots of people not from the university, etc. And she's interested in policy and community engagement, marvelous work, and in changing things. And in New York City, I also got to know Natalie Jurjemenko, whose art, design, urban projects are very much about thinking and making and imagining. So her sort of central trope is the environmental health clinic. Also hanging out with, if you know Natalie, hanging out with Natalie in the city was a treat, to say the least. And as Peter mentioned, moving on here, after having moved to LA and UCLA, I had the opportunity to learn from people like yourself. I mean, there's so much amazing work going on here, but also draw on the kind of European infrastructural thinking that had become part of the lab earlier. So we started to think about how to build capacity, not just for individual problems or areas, but more generally. And how do you build a structure for that? And we took building humane infrastructures as a focus, and we did different kinds of program building, which led to this March 2020 workshop. And I worked with Francesca Albresi, Todd Bresner, David Skorberg, and others. And this is from one session on the inhumane infrastructures homelessness. We had some amazing people there, not least Theo Henderson, who was the creator of the podcast We the Unhoused, and he was unhoused himself. So we started this, and I was the moderator, I gave him considerable time. I gave him all the time, and let the professors and city councilmen and the others talk afterwards. And the idea was to move forward together and considering the role the university could play in relation to such an enormous and complex challenge, but specifically also thinking about experimental humanities programs and information studies in that context. So one thing that developed out of this work was a stronger interest in building capacity, the mobilizing that Peter was referencing earlier, which is an aspirational effort. And when looking for places where this kind of work, outward-facing work was going on, the aspirational humanities sort of stuck out. They're close to the humanities, they work on a kind of systematic level, at least the bigger ones, so not just single scholars or centers. And it also was a place, or is a place, where humanity seemed empowered to think ahead and be aspirational. And also they have a long history of negotiating this space. Medical humanities is a good example, placed in between biomedicine and the humanities in different ways, and changing over time too. So in one text on the medical humanities, that argues in favor of a more active, engaged medical humanities, it says that the field can come across, and quote, as the domain of pleasant but more or less inconsequential helpmeets, lurking, hopefully, poetry books in hand, at the edges of the clinical encounter's primal scene. And I think anyone who's been involved in negotiating these kinds of spaces, coming from the humanities or arts, for example, have a sense of the kind of what's the primal scene, and these negotiations and learning from them, I think, is important. And it points to the complexity of being, critical and constructive at the same time. And I really think you need to do things as you do in this room to get this. Art and design people know this, of course, and have tools like material practices, prototyping, quit sessions, etc. So what we try to do, sort of living this somewhat at ASU, Arizona State University, using ASU as a kind of platform, is an interesting school. And one example is the infrastructure clinic. So I've been working with Xiaoxin Wei, who's a media arts, philosophy, mathematics, and sort of gestural technology expert, interesting guy. And we sort of came up with this concept of a world-facing service where people could take some social form in which they live, like a city, a way of life, or a social technological infrastructure for treatment and care. And the IC would set this up with different actors to make infrastructures work better, that is, in a more humane, efficient, and life-affirming way. And we said that the response will be shaped by the patient. So there's certainly an aspirational aspect to this, also in the sense that there is no infrastructure clinic. And we'll see if we get some traction later. But the idea was that there would be a place where you could come, of course. And so kind of prototype or mock-up, perhaps. And the pushback that you get in processes like that from smart people is also very important. So the clinic, for instance, as a frame, can be problematic. It's very instrumental, it's expert-driven, it's hierarchical, etc. And the question is also what's the real community engagement here? I said the response will be shaped by the patient, but is that really good enough? So in my, you may have a note to myself to actually bring it up. In my Humane Infrastructures book, I staged a critique session towards the very end on the infrastructure clinic, including some of the dialogues and pushback that we came across. Although I'm playing all the parts myself, which perhaps makes it easier. So let me move on and look more closely at the aspirational humanities. So starting out from an example, architectural humanities. What you see here is a part of a description of a course given at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, in Stockholm on architectural humanities. And just highlighting a few things here. So if you notice emerging field here, it's very representative of all these new humanities forms. They're always emerging. They're in the process of becoming. So for example, even though digital humanities has been around from at least the early 2000s, with the history, some would say to the 1940s, it's still described as a still emerging field by leading journal Digital Humanities Quarterly, at least as of last week. So what you can see here too is an interdisciplinary, intersectional ethos and a perceived need to work in alternative ways. So there's a sense that you need to be different, especially in relation to conventional humanities disciplines. And why? Well, because the questions and challenges and topics tackled take them, they would argue, outside the institutional frame. So that's why you need alternative modes of engagement. For example, as it says here, speculative and iconoclastic approaches. You need to work outside disciplines, etc., and reaching out, including here at the very bottom, I think artistic practice is one of the things mentioned here. So one interesting thing I find is the relation between these kinds of aspirations and what's actually done on the ground. I mean, there's naturally a gap here, typically. And the question, I think, is how large it is, and if you never actually try the things you aspire to, for example, connecting with artistic practice or collaborating with corporations. I've seen this many times. It can be, problematic, or if you do it as something you have to do towards the end of a project rather than in an integrated fashion. So there is there's also tension between these kinds of positionalities, I guess I could call them, and institutionalization. So once architectural humanities has become its own department, when it has journals, conferences, etc., and its own graduate students, it typically becomes more difficult to be different and aspirational. There's a pressure to conform, and I think perhaps a pressure that's easier to handle for institutions like design, media arts than it is for sort of more conventional disciplinary setups. So architectural humanities at KTH is spearheaded by Jennifer Mack, anthropologist and historian of the built environment. It's mostly a course, so it's very different from something like environmental humanities. And she is one of the many scholars working on projects with real-world impact and potential. So among other things, she runs a project looking at mid-20th century Scandinavian modernist suburbs, miljonprogrammet, so to give 1 million people housing, essentially. That they were explicitly intended to build a better future, to realize utopia. And it's a kind of public housing project that has received widespread critique over the decades and been heavily politicized, not least now, in the wake of a stronger extreme right in Sweden, too, perhaps I should add. And MAC uses various strategies to investigate such processes and framings, but she's also very interested in how do you actually do that kind of work, changing the frames, making a difference in the world. And she does ethnography, among other things, actually following people living there, as opposed to this kind of headline thing where actually I saw yesterday someone, a politician in Sweden, suggesting that we tear them down, or parts of them, and start all over. So Mac attended a workshop we organized this summer in Malmö, as Peter mentioned too, in this initiative, Critical-Connective Tissue, Making Worlds with Humanities. So one of the things we're trying to do is to bring people like her and others together across disciplines and fields. And ultimately also thinking about we can do that kind of work on some scale, and emphasizing the in-between, and not sort of having criticality by itself. And I'll come back to the Malmö workshop at the very end. You can see here two small but still, Todd Presner from UCLA in conversation with Sally Kitch from ASU on the new humanities in particular, or aspiring humanities, particularly in the context of curricular activity. So this is from the virtual session that was before the Malmö meeting. It actually was really a set of really interesting conversations, and there is a write-up, a fairly thorough write-up, so you can get to this through the link or the QR code there directly too. So the linguistic setup of these constructions is very simple. You take a word and you add humanities. So global, add humanities, global humanities, which is different than global studies. So the question, I guess, is how many humanities do we know? I was thinking of this kind of counting beans in the jar or whatever. Quite a few actually, but some of them very, very passing. The muscular humanities, for instance. And you see some examples here. And these are often grouped together, especially the ones at the very top, digital, environmental, urban, medical. I think it's important to realize that these are obviously different. Not only if you look at this list, is there a difference in terms of entrenchment, but also they're different in other ways. In the article I've written on aspirational humanities, I have a section where I contrast digital humanities and environmental humanities. So difference in epistemic commitments, the way we do work, infrastructural engagement. So whereas environmental humanities doesn't really, I think too much about infrastructure. There was a report in Sweden before a major government funding scheme that said that one good thing about investing in environmental humanities is that they don't need any infrastructure. We don't need any infrastructure at all. Whereas digital humanities, of course, has an infrastructural kind of body, technology as part of the makeup. And they're also different in terms of their aspirations. So environmental humanities has this kind of grand challenges, trying to save the world kind of thing. Digital humanities tends to be much more low-key, or at least I think has been that historically. But when you do find these strong aspirational efforts, it's usually in relation to technology or things like cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage, for example. Hi, Francesca and John. It's usually in that kind of context. Digitalizing everything, for example, is a kind of dream. So experimental here is a little bit different than the others, I think, because it can be used to describe a specific variety, but it's also super term. I think it's been used like that here at UCLA, including urban, environmental, etc. And it's part of a group of terms that denote super terms, experimental, hybrid, etc. And they pick up perceived qualities in these humanities. They're new, they're emergent, they're experimental, they're integrative. And while these terms are analytical, they're also programmatic, I would argue. So integrative humanities is built on an idea about the necessity of coming together across knowledge areas, and the university coming together with the outside world. Sverker Sölin, the environmental historian at KTH, writes about this. Post-humanities, another superordinate category, sort of, is grounded in moving away from the humanist ideal of man and supremist anthropos. Rosie Braidotti is one of the spearheading people there. So they carry with them directionality and future aspiration, just like the individual formations do, like plant or urban humanities. And there is a kind of ontology here. I have a chart, but I'll spare you the chart. I can show you later if you want to. But see, it's a dark room. Maybe I should keep it. In my article, I argue that we can learn and build on the emerging aspirational humanities. And if I use medical or health humanities as an example again situated between the humanities, social sciences, arts on the one side, and medical education, biomedicine, and medical practice on the other. There's been, for one thing, there's been a trajectory over time, I think, towards a more critical medical humanities, health humanities, for example. But there is a substantial body of valuable reflections on issues such as handling structural complicity of collaborating institutions, including the university, racial bias, for instance, power hierarchies, engaging societal challenges across different scales, from local situated health to planetary health. Of course, they have a program, I think a building too at ASU for planetary health. So that's the scale. And also reconciling supportive functions with an interventionist activist role. So anyone who's been in these kinds of liminal spaces in the lab, for example, will know that. I mean, how do you someone comes and wants 10,000 slides digitalized or something like that, and you're suggesting an interpretive approach to something, those kinds of negotiations are ongoing, all the time. And the aspirational humanities also, I think, provide a useful lead-in to consider humanistic and critical engagement more broadly. And there can be danger, of course, in having aspirations. You can be accused for, far-reaching promise and speculation, for not being realistic, etc. And as we saw in the very beginning, plant humanities, for example, such promises are often negative and vague, claiming that grand challenges cannot be handled without the humanities, which is bold, but nowhere near the promise of transformation associated with some other fields, especially and themes, particularly technology-driven ones. So let me just move to that one. For example, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI asserted in 2024 that AI is transforming the world as we know it, creating a future where AI will impact humans in ways we can only imagine today, and that the Institute will consequently guide and build the future of AI through advancing AI research, education, policy, and practice to improve the human conditions. And such visions are not only hyperbolic, but often come across as, I think, unconnected to context, lived experience, and community-based knowledge. And since the goal is set in the far future, other alternatives, lines, if you want, can be closed off or erased along the way. So is there a future where AI doesn't transform the world? And can humanity tackle grand challenges without the urban or environmental humanities? Probably. Or it doesn't make a difference, I guess. But it's interesting because looking at the Stanford website now, compared to when I did this earlier, it's actually much more human-centered now, which is a good thing. The question, I guess, is whether that reflects actual work. So perhaps someone from the humanities arts pointed out the fact that the initiative was high on technologically driven sort of futurity and low on human agency. It may not be an ideal process or the main job of these fields, humanities arts, to do that, but important work anyhow. So, I mean, we need to be at the table early on, but not, I think, just to grab a seat, but because it makes sense to everyone. We have to make the case that it makes sense, I think. I think it's really interesting to see how such negotiations take place. There's certainly tension, especially as the humanities are often hesitant to predict themselves as worldly change makers. It's a resistance to becoming too instrumental or out in the world. And I mean, we study, or humanists study these discourses in other contexts critically. Things like smart cities or greenwashing or whatever. So let me stay with AI briefly and look at 2 examples of such negotiations. I'll test your Swedish first. So this is an ad for a BA program, Philosophy in AI at Umeå University. And the question here is, do you want to or wish to influence the way AI shapes our society? And while this call to action is fine on one level, it positions the humanities, I think, as a second thought in a world where the impact and place of AI is given. So the humanities can potentially influence while AI shapes. So the frame is already set. The humanities can also be reluctant, I think, to engage with actors which are not, we talked a little bit about that earlier, not seen as critical, including AI people, even if the humanities are willing to engage. So this is an example from Yale News. So in the beginning, in early 2024, Yale formed an AI task force, and it turned out that there weren't any humanists on the task force, surprisingly. So in the heat of the moment, this is a response from 2 faculty involved in critical computing, one of which is a fantastic scholar. I mean, many of us know his work. So this article has excellent sections on the value and power of critical analysis, but it kind of stops there. And I think it's stuck in a frame. So the humanities become sort of distant, not engaging, and there is no how or suggestion for how to connect. And it's understandable in a way because they were left out, so they're not likely to be very happy. But I do think this is important, and I'm not sort of picking on them, but just to look this is from towards the end of this article, but things like how you frame yourself. So mission creep is a concept here, and I think the assumption here is that there's a risk that industry can shift the mission, perhaps in the wrong direction. I think mission creep can actually be a good thing. And in the second part here, it says, it can feel insulting to problem solvers and system builders to hear their language might not be totally under their control, or their taken for granted ideas carry implications, sometimes dangerous ones, that stretch far beyond their labs and design screens. I don't think this is again, it's a particular context, but it's not the kind of thing that helps to start a dialogue or a collaboration. You place yourself in the corner in a way. And I think really aspiration and vision can play an important role here. And one part of that can be to break out of a kind of deconstructive box and engage more broadly, which requires integrity, a lot of integrity, but also an interest in changing things and a willingness to change yourself too. And the same is true for collaborators, of course. I mean, when I was here at UCLA, one thing I was a little bit surprised about early on was when I wanted to engage with corporations, companies outside, I got, there was just a bit of pushback because there is a big bureaucracy, and those kinds of questions are handled by this particular function. So the idea of just walking out to, Silicon Beach, where I was close, I live in Playa del Rey, wasn't really comfortable to some of my colleagues. So let's see what I have here. Aspirations can lock down positions, be overly hyperbolic, and come across as uncritical. At the same time, I think this is the tricky thing, and why I'm interested in this too. They can carry hope, imagination, and force us to consider alternative futures. And I mean, here's just some examples. I mentioned Natalie earlier, artist and engineer, Natalie Jeremenko, calls for a different kind of environmental imagination beyond environmentalism, and only, as she would say, only zero emissions. She wants to make things better. Janelle Alston, executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, points to how imagination is central to preserving and holding a story for generations to come, as well as for building an institution where justice can be practiced, and quote, within its institutional DNA. Feminist and interaction designer Marie-Louise Juhl was part of a medical and bioengineering collaboration around a kind of home version of a urinary testing tool, challenging how most femtech products reproduce dominant values of technology. And she's resisting women as patients, bodies as under medical scrutiny, and the home as hospital. And she's interested in all kind of bodily fluids, I should say, too. There's a bunch of articles. But what Juhl offered was not primarily or only a way of designing products in a given framework. She was called on as a designer, interaction designer, to enter this group. But there are other ways to rethink the situation and reimagine what might be possible solutions, not just abstractly, but materially. And this was step by step. You don't come into space like that and take your theory and sort of project it, and you're not selling a pitch, but you learn from the others. That's what she says, shifting and collaborating. And lots of good work here. I won't go through. This list could be very long, but I really appreciate both Sarah Hendren's work and Marato's work, if you're not familiar with it. Very, very relevant work for this kind of topic. So I think much of this boils down to practice, how we do things, how we connect ideas and aspirations to different kinds of making. But taking the step from, and I'm looking at it from a kind of humanistic perspective, taking the step from critical deconstructive scholarship to actively redesigning the object of study is challenging for several reasons. And also the opposite, or different kinds of versions of that. So it's not just the humanities, of course. And in an earlier study, I looked at how the humanities are described in different kinds of materials. For instance, the Humanities World Report 2015, where they collected lots of materials from lots of sources and interviews, etc. And they use categories such as to describe what the humanities do. Having intrinsic value, benefiting society, informing social policy, understanding cultural heritage, promoting economic value, contributing to other academic disciplines, promoting critical thinking and innovation. And the operative verbs here are have, benefit, inform, understand, promote, and contribute. And I would argue that there are degrees of agency and activity here. For instance, having intrinsic value seems to have suggest less agency than promoting or contributing to something. I also looked at data from Swedish universities, how they describe the humanities, 13 comprehensive universities, and the most common verbs, and this is how they write about what they do, so it's not what they actually do. The most common verbs used to describe what the humanities do and offer is understand, followed by analyze, interpret, study, and other verbs included explore, explain, have insights, give insights, and finding answers. There's also one or two places solution or solve problems. My sense from reading these texts is that the solve ones seem more templated and less sort of with not as much resolution as the more conventional modes of engagement. So these verbs can invoke different modes of engagement, essentially ways of doing work and engaging with the world. And I've used the term repertoire or epistemic repertoire to talk about these, especially a range, in this case, the humanities. So based on this material, I think you could argue that the humanities have an epistemological vocabulary low on verbs such as imagine, make, build, change, and intervene. David Theo Goldberg argues that the humanities have been slow to reposition its own mode of activity. And I have a very rough, I don't know how it's going to call it, scale. It's kind of model, I guess. So the topmost ones here are from the study I just mentioned, my own the material I've looked at. And then towards the end are more of the kind of agentive, making, creative terms. And you could add 100 others, of course, and there is no, the order can be contested and everything. But still, I think it's interesting to think about. Also in the sense that I've been to workshops and I organized workshops where humanists have been asked to solve or approach challenges. And usually doesn't work out well. My sense is that it's often you get solutionist kind of approaches often. This is true if, digital humanities too, at least earlier. So you have fantastically brilliant critical analysis coming to the computer or to digital technologies and sort of seemingly losing some of that criticality. Let's recreate Rome photorealistically, yes, but there might be more interesting ways of thinking about your material and interpretive questions, etc. I'm soon going to wrap up. The argument I wanted to make here too is that this is not about one field or area doing all these things, of course. So the challenge here is to do things together, to work across knowledge traditions and practices. So we were talking earlier, where I mentioned the term arenas for transversal knowledge production. I think that's something we need to be aspirational about. And have a few minutes, I'm keeping track of time, Peter. So I'm going to just end this with an end note. So this is from the workshop we did this summer in Malmö. And I was just going to point it out as an arena for transversal knowledge production on a very small scale, but still. So end of June, Malmö, as you may know, is a city in the south of Sweden, demographically diverse, close to the continent. People fly into Copenhagen in Denmark and just it's a short train ride over. And Malmö University has a strong and community-engaged art and design presence. So the workshop was broadly about mobilizing critical capacity, conversations, not presentations, very few upfront things. A large share of the participants hadn't met beforehand, so probably 15 disciplines or something, mainly humanities arts, but also computer science, design, etc. This is not the best photo material I have, but I think you can still see that people actually listen to each other, in these conversations. So setting something up, as a curator, that's a very important thing. So we talked about the how of mobilizing capacity through themes like shifting frames. Jennifer Mack, whom I mentioned earlier, was part of this. Convening power, the university's convening power in particular. I'm here, but when UCLA asks, people will come, often, I think. And you can set these things up, not just with people like myself, but with corporations, with NGOs, whatever, and you can use that as a kind of tool moving forward. And designing, and one of the people in that session was Karen Bradshaw, legal scholar from ASU, who's just finishing a book or publishing a book on depolarization. She talked about that fantastic work. And then designing futures with Besad Khosravi Nouri, who's an artist who's doing work on the School of Imagination, located in the fishing port in Karachi in Pakistan. Brilliant. So one of the key individual contributions during the first day was by Jan Mendes in the top left here. So when I contacted her and described the setup, etc., she clearly didn't buy the aspirational ethos. I had an inkling that might be the case, but she wrote back and she said, "My work is about the embrace of hopelessness, not about making things better." So she does work on Black Death and Black motherhood, really good work. But I asked her whether we could use the embrace of hopelessness as a title, and I gave her the prime spot, the best spot the first day as part of the discussion, this kind of setup. And I'm going to wrap this up. So the second day we did critical constructive workshops. People talked very briefly about their work, a little bit like a crit session, very briefly, showed their work very briefly, talked about what they wanted to do in relation to society, etc. And we had, 50 minutes or so for each project. So we had an artist, someone from classics, and an activist media studies person, Erin Corey, who does work on tattooing and immigration in Sweden and Denmark. And the second day, afternoon, we had a capacity building workshop. And I felt that the capacity framing was too abstract and not very useful. But there was actually quite a few productive discussions leading all kinds of directions, but not about capacity per se. So when the discussions were going on, I went outside and took some notes for the wrap-up. One of the moments where you actually have a little bit of time in the midst of intense work. And it occurred to me then that the capacity I had been looking for and we'd set up the event for was actually there in the room and the extended networks. So I could have thrown, and we did throw things at this group, and they could use their networks, etc. So in a sense, we were the aspired capacity, but also the capacity to aspire. And that's where I want to end. Perhaps that's the aspirational humanities. Thank you.
Back to that one slide with the list. Yeah, perfect.
It can be contested in multiple ways, but I think it's... Right. Can I just add one thing, Peter?
Yeah.
So, because we have a politically tense moment, not only in the US, but also in Sweden, one thing I've noticed is that there's an increased presence of humanists in, mostly newspapers, different media, and I've started to see more clearly their value. So, and they're moving, I think they're moving down. So they're questioning, unsettling, provoking, imagining, and to some degree framing, which I think is interesting.
Yeah,
I'm just going to...
Two mics, and you can hang on to one, and we'll pass this back and forth. I think I want to get to questions really quickly. Hi, that's loud. I wanted to get to everybody's questions really quickly. Can we turn that down just a bit? Let's see. Actually,
and I should also mention, I didn't see.
Yeah, you take that.
Yeah. I was just going to mention too. Maybe I did actually. But Francesca sitting over there was a key person in the Humane Infrastructures project.
Okay, so let's see if that's better. I just wanted to bring this up, actually, about this political moment. And one of the reasons I was so excited to have Patrik come in was because I feel that his work on the aspirational humanities and his attempt to bring these different communities together really speaks to the way that research functions within art, design, and architecture programs. In other words, our particular school. And it's one of the ways that I hope we can make these connections with not just the middle of campus, which is which is humanities and social sciences, but also moving even deeper into our south, which is engineering, medicine. And I feel that, and I'm not the first one to think this, but we have had a hermeneutics of suspicion as a kind of key focus of humanities since at least the 1960s. And it's done wonderful institutional critique. But that institutional critique, which has tended to come from the left, is now being completely instantiated by the right, but with jackboots on. And I think that this is a moment for us to think about how the generative capacities of the way that certain forms of pedagogy in the arts, architecture, design might be able to help us build rather than critique. And I guess my question is, how do we instantiate this? Is it through this kind of community building across things? Is it something one can do in the classroom? Is it all of the above? So, I mean, an unanswerable question, but a place to start. Yeah.
All of the, I can use this one, I guess, all of the above. Does this work, or should we have one only?
No, I'm going to then...
Oh, yeah, pass it around. Yeah.
This one around.
I mean, just walking around here, I got lost at first, of course. but this kind of space speaks too. I think infrastructural imagination is one category here, and so we started an art school. We had an art school. We started an arts campus at Umeå. So we had an institute of fine arts, design institute, and we moved the Museum of Contemporary Visual Arts, and we built a lab there too, and started the School of Architecture. So, but that's the kind of place where you take people too, because there is a kind of vibrancy in the studio environments, just seeing students do their work. And it's different than sort of the conventional departments. So I think that's a kind of scene that you can use. That's useful. But I think more generally, I mean, the University of UCLA. I mean, you have all these sort of university-wide programming, but I would really love something that's perhaps a little bit more challenging. You know, bringing in people from local communities, from corporations, etc., come together, prep it a little bit, so you have a potential outcome, and use, because I think one of the things we do in these kinds of spaces, but also in the humanities, is to curate. Yes. You know, ideas, people, etc. That's a very useful skill.
And concepts, as we
see
this list right here. I would love to open this up to people, and Danny Svensson, thank you. It's always a hard to go first.
I love to raise my hand. Patrik, it's so nice to have you back on campus, and I really enjoyed this. I couldn't help but have my Raymond Williams radar ping when I see the word emerging. And so I'm thinking, of course he talks about the emergent, the dominant, and the residual, and as this kind of motion that things go through. And it made me think, what are the residual humanities? If these aspirational humanities are popping up everywhere, these kinds of hopes to change something, I think especially alongside urban humanities or environmental humanities about questions of degrowth, but also how certain, I think this rhymes with what Peter is saying around the hermeneutics of suspicion. We've seen a number of things collapse: the new criticism, French theory, most recent speculative realism. Maybe we can think of something that's withered and fallen off the vine. And so I'm curious, in these conversations with these groups, if the question of are there things that we can afford to lose in the humanities?
So what was the last thing?
Are there things we can afford to lose? Are there things that might be better pruned, I guess, or that are there ways of thinking about degrowth in relationship to the aspirational?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting, and I guess the residual humanities that are a thing too. When you do, I've done a fair bit of work on research infrastructure, which is a big thing in Europe and to some degree becoming more important here too. And if you propose a research infrastructure project, you have to have a plan for dismantling it, for end of life kind of perspectives on that. I want to add to, this is about the aspirational humanities. For me, the kind of these arenas for transversal knowledge production or moving forward on these issues is very much about the established humanities as well. So in some of the, I think, literature or writing about these new varieties, there is a very clear distancing, leaving wherever you came from, starting something new. And I think for, let's say, the infrastructure clinic, or for doing this kind of work forward, I think the individual projects, the kind of deep knowledge, all kinds of things can be key. So it's not sort of, replacing. I think there's a natural kind of process going on within disciplines too, of course, as you were saying.
If I could just add one thing, one of the things that's been withering is the past. And this is a real problem for the humanities in general, which is the attention to studying the immediate present. And I think that has to do quite a bit with the 20th century's vast expansion of cultural and knowledge production that then created this huge corpus to study. And then, the 17th century is dropping away, the 6th century is dropping away, whole areas and millennia are dropping away from study within that. And when we look at things like, we've already given up on a lot of expectation of especially in the Anglosphere, non-English language study, right? So classics teaches classics and translations. ELTS, right, our co-sponsor, European language and I think transcultural studies is starting to teach Goethe in English, right? That's a pruning that we might want to wonder about, and that's certainly one that's been enforced by people who I don't think are thinking in the way that either Patrik or you are thinking about pruning. Not good gardeners.
The re-emergence of the historical humanities.
Yeah.
That's an aspiration.
And I think also just to add to that, to the earlier part, so my sense is that the interface, these kinds of liminal spaces or arenas, or whatever you call them, are critical also in the sense that they can interface with different kinds of knowledge or knowledge traditions and scholars. So when you need experts to come together for something, for one thing, such places can help in the sense of, you don't have to have subscribed to the environmental humanities list or whatever. You can be asked to be part of something, and if that's interesting to you for your research interests or whatever, and also societally relevant, can be a kind of win-win situation. So when we work with, in HUMla, this is a long time ago, when we worked with National Bank, we started to work with National Bank. One of the challenges they had at that time was to think about what to do with their bank palaces. All the space they had centrally in cities, etc. When people started to use internet banks instead. It's different here in the US still, I think. You can't even almost get into bank in Sweden now, and they don't do checks, they don't have any cash. So they were thinking about this, and they were also thinking about the internet bank, etc. So we brought in an ethnographer who's doing feminist work on welding robots up in the north in Sweden. So she came and she took a couple of days and did work in the bank. You could actually get in there and made observations. And the other person that was involved was Erica Robles-Anderson, who was a postdoc. And she's done great work on megachurches and their use of digital, different kinds of technologies. So she talked about not having physical money. She talked about moving away from physical Bibles, and that expert knowledge that was brought into the space, that was really fun.
Thank you for the talk. I'm really enjoying it. I'm having trouble articulating my questions, I think because, kind of new to looking at things from the more institutional level. But I teach here, and something that I've been sort of going back and forth a lot in my teaching is this sense of, should I be teaching this more analytical, critical side of things, what's more kind of typically in the humanities departments right now, or trying to combine that more with the more artistic, creative outcomes for classes, teaching, creative writing alongside the literature, for instance. And I'm wondering if you think this helps or hurts with the kind of extreme specialization of some of those new humanity fields that you were talking about.
And for one thing, they're in a sense, they're specialized, but they're also bringing people from different disciplines together. So there is a kind of openness. I think it's interesting. I guess one question is whether your students are they from all over? Are they humanities students, or are they from here?
I'm teaching in DH, so they're all over in the sense of engineering, social science, and humanities.
Yeah. Because I mean, my experience is that my personal experience is that the sort of jump or shift from sort of more critical approach or critical way of thinking, deconstructive or whatever, to a more constructive modality is difficult and something that needs to be, you need to be trained, or you need to actually be able to try things out. So I would think that you need both in a way, but depending on where you come from too, but I think the combination is really important. It's great. I mean, if you think about, I've done this in the past. So you have someone do a great talk on a critique of smart cities, concept of smart cities, all these attempts and nuanced kind of analysis. And then you ask, and I've done this too, so what would you do so I pretended to be a Swedish billionaire. And I said, I'll invest 100 million into this project. You've just been talking about some of these big. What would you do? And it's like if you run a lab. I've been experienced this too, and you're prepared. You have a funding agency come, and you're prepared to do everything you do with them institutionally, tell them, etc. And they say, what do you want to do? We can give you money. You need to be prepared. I think there's something in, the combination, moving from one to the other, not losing track of the kind of depth of critical knowledge. I think in the age, it's different now, I think, but in the past, there was certainly an overemphasis on the kind of, on the making in a way, the making component. So what kind of DH course? Is it all kinds?
I've taught the 101. Currently, I'm teaching a social media analytics. I'm kind of coming in from English and radio, so part of it's audio and NLP. So, it's interesting, and I'm kind of seeing some of those creative, critical things kind of percolate out of there a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one way perhaps is to, as I'm sure you're doing, to connect to strands of work sort of outside of DH that's critical but also materially embedded. I'm thinking about work in some sound studies, for example. That's actually both really in a way. Jonathan Stern, for example, who passed away recently, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Patrik, so wonderful to have you back on campus, and always a joy. I'm from working with you, I'm very well aware of how you use the term curating, but you have this way of, you're almost like a magnet for incredible individuals coming together to do this kind of work. And I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit of the immense amount of labor that I know that you do in order to make that happen, because it looks so seamless when you talk about it, right? And yet these infrastructures are often driven by a lot of intense work, intense thought, preparation, and also negotiation, right? In terms of upsetting structures or rethinking structures, right? That oftentimes you're asking people to exit their comfort zones and try something new and different. And if you could share a little bit of your experience there.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, and I think, so the way I and we, because we've been doing this together too, trying to sort of do this kind of creation and setting things up. I think one thing is to, for one thing, to bring people together that might not have met otherwise. And of course that takes work, and especially also if you're not asking people to do their PowerPoint presentation, you're asking them to engage in a one-on-one conversation, and not have any kind of preparations or notes or, so I'm trying to, in this practice, trying to sort of, it's an intellectual task, It's the different people, the competences, their personalities, etc. But it's also the material, how you materially manifest that. So thinking about, so one thing, you know, when I was in the lab, I had access to all that technology. And as staff, 25 people, can do all kinds of things, you know, experiments. So we, you know, for one event with, you know, stellar scholars, we said no PowerPoints. And of course, that's out of your comfort zone. But we suggested, you know, if you want to, you can use our screenscape. So we have 11 screens peripherally placed here, and we have software. We built software to help people prepare narratives that could be extended in this kind of. Of course, that's a lot of work. It takes work to get people to come too. But I think, you know, if you have something to offer, that's not the typical thing. That makes it easier to. And thinking, I mean, as anyone who's done programming or planned events, thinking about the contrasts, thinking about pace, thinking about provocations, about, you know, the whole composition. I tend to do one-track things too, as you know, so no multiple things at the same time. Everyone in the space at the same time. And like with Jan Mendes, whom I mentioned, you know, she is not the kind of typical person you would bring to something aspirational, you know, in the sense we were talking about. It took me some time to get her to come, and she was, I mean, when she talked about her work, everyone, you know, it was just very, very powerful. And that fed into the whole event, I think. So, and it's different, you know, from time to time. But I think it's a continued kind of experimentation too. You know, I always try to do. I'm talking about my own work here, my practice. I always try to do something new, at least something new. So as you know well, you know, pair conversations. You know, as I said, you know, two people, you know, may not know each other before, around a theme that connects to both of them and to the theme of the event, and they get a minute or two to talk about their work, and then they're supposed to be having a conversation. So we had one like that at the Malmö event, which was really interesting, I think. So an analytical philosophy researcher and an artist sort of doing this together. And it didn't really take off. So they had, you know, it was difficult for them to actually do this conversation. But the analytical philosophy person, he talked about impossible choices in relation to a project in medicine, you know, in medical practice. And he, in analytical philosophy, I've learned this now, kind of practice, he deferred the value or valuing of things. It's not that he didn't care, but it came later. And there was this kind of, at least 3 critical culture studies scholars, you know, attacking him, more or less, calling him out, as the term is. So afterwards, I've been thinking about, you know, it's just an example of also reflecting on what you do, you know, what it means, what I meant, you know, the calling out bit, which I, in this particular case, I didn't, you know, it worked out well, but it didn't feel particularly generative. These are mixed things, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think it's interesting too,
Oh,
in the sense
can you
that.
just use the mic? Sorry.
Thank you. Absolutely, and I think it's also interesting in the way that quite often you're setting the stage for something spontaneous and wonderful to happen within a moment, right, where you bring those types of people together, which seems like a counterpoint to what we're experiencing right now with this AI moment, where everything feels like it's becoming more of a performance and scripted around these generative technologies, right, where we're seeing a kind of regurgitation happen again and again and again. And I think that this way that you curate really in this moment is so profound. So thank you.
Yeah, you don't know. I mean, you don't know what's going to come out of it either. But there is a degree of I mean, the unscriptedness of it can certainly be challenging too. Scripted to unscripted. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it also takes, not being okay with things being dynamic,
Any other questions? Oh, over here. Oh, right over there. Wait.
I did have a question too, but sorry, I didn't have this up also. Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Jade. I'm in the Information Studies department here. I kind of had two questions that sort of relate. My first question was if there is a specific impetus that you identify within the humanities for this, I guess, production of all these different camps or versions of humanities, if it's rhizomatic or very structured. I think you had mentioned you had made like an org chart or something about connecting these, so maybe that might...
So what was the beginning of your question? Sorry.
Yeah, is there like a specific thing that you can identify for why the humanities produces all of these variations as maybe opposed to STEM disciplines or social sciences even? That's kind of my first question. And then I guess my second question is, maybe if this is a question of when or what, I'm not sure, but when does an emergent field become, I guess, or move beyond emergence? Is that like a when question, or is that a what question of are they seeking to become established with, air quotes? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. These are good questions too. I think it's probably a what question in this, because I think I was saying or using a quote too. I mean, it's part of the emergingness or emergent character of these is can be part of the identity. I think digital humanities is a good example. But when you get more institutional, it becomes more difficult to maintain that kind of liminality too, I think. And it's different in different places, in different institutions too. And it's different for different fields. So that's why I think the histories of these different disciplines or fields also matter. So digital humanities, I think, originally was built up of many experts, but not only faculty, but experts of different kinds that left or wanted to leave their homes, their departmental or disciplinary homes. So they escaped in a way. Environmental humanities, I think, is a totally different kind of thing. So you had a number of fields sort of come together. Some of these were environmental history, for example. They were already established, and these people usually didn't leave their homes to become part of the environmental humanities. So I think that's important too, that they're different. And about these, all these varieties or new humanities and why and how, I mean, for one thing, it's a pretty smart thing to do. So let's say you're embarking on some study or you have a project or something. It's easy. I mean, I know Sverker Sölin, so they become interested in ice. And ice humanities is a kind of good, useful framing of that, and it's more ambitious, I guess, or it can seem more ambitious than starting a center or even a journal or something. And because it's a productive pattern, I mean, I guess once it's started too, and it's, I guess, also part of the sort of life or death or whatever of the humanities, kind of seeking of models outside the traditional disciplines. I don't think it's relating to the earlier discussion too. I don't think it's a matter of perhaps a balance too between different things. So I don't know how many faculty do you have at the English department? Yeah. So, and how many in DH? Very good question. I know they overlap. Yeah, but I mean there is a kind of balancing of things too. I don't know if it's going to continue. I mean, maybe it's going to die out. I don't know. I mean, many of them have been claimed, it seems. Yeah, I have a typology that depending on the level of entrenchment and other things too.
Yeah, thank you. I think just like real quickly off of that, I think the institutional part, the establishment part, the first thing that comes to mind for me, especially in like information studies, is like the creation of journals. That like once you have sort of an established journal, established, air quotes again, that's when you've sort of made it, I guess. And that maybe it's that's less of a one question, but that what of like the production, again, of knowledge.
It's interesting, I mean, with information studies. So I mean, there's another category of disciplinary formations that are similar in some ways. So studies, ethnic studies, queer studies, information studies, cultural studies, etc. And you can look at those two over time. And I think information studies is a good example, and culture studies too, where I think when you get more institutionalized, I think you lose some of that often early drive or whatever, and you have to become more generic or whatever. But they're similar in many ways.
I just wanted to follow up on that, because when you think about this moment in the aspirational humanities, you can also think back to the early 20th century and the formation, late 19th, early 20th century formations of sociology, communication, and anthropology. All three of which can almost be seen to be pruning. Anthropology is literally pruning itself into non-existence. Communication, in many ways, in my opinion, has kind of made such a connection with commerce and with corporate funding that it ceased to be interesting quite some time ago. And sociology seems to be in a kind of death throes in the same way that anthropology was 15 or 20 years ago. So those were the emergent fields of the study of the human 100 years ago. So maybe they do have that kind of emergent, dominant, and death throes, what is that? I forget the last one. Rattle. So I just thought I'd add that before we move over to Chelly. You're it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful talk today. I really appreciate this kind of valence of aspirational humanities. This kind of comes to me at a very specific point in time. I just had a unit with my students about frameworks of knowledge production and very much thinking about these different frameworks. And especially in a moment like this, a student asked, like, why come to an institution, or why come to school? Is this even an art school, etc.? And not to reduce it to it's the friends we make along the way, but there is something incredibly valuable that I don't want to dismiss in this curation of bringing people together across disciplines that's bringing these emergent collective thinking moments. But something I find, and I'm curious and keen to hear your perspective on, if there's strategies or even examples that you have from your experience, is we're creating this knowledge that I find incredibly valuable. But how do we extend it into a place where it really moves into the tangible, the physical, into policy making, into actionable change within the communities? I'm curious on like how maybe it's not a gap, and it's my potential limited view to see it as a gap, but I'm kind of curious how we can take from our knowledge and build it into something that's accessible beyond this horizon, like beyond within our context, but beyond it. And if you have any thoughts on how we can really extend into that.
Thank you very much. I think so. So one thing I experienced with the lab at Umeå, so the lab was open to everyone essentially. Also, I mean, students all over. It's really amazing that we got the support to do it. So it was paid for initially by the humanities, and so but all the schools, all the students could be there, and we were also trying to work with local communities, etc. But it was also very academic in a way, you know. So not everyone was there. Not every part of the city of Umeå was represented among our users. So I think it's very important to think about how you engage outside, and also how we as a university or institutions, how we engage. I personally built labs. I'm not so interested in that anymore. So I'm more interested in, think about infrastructure, for example, to actually move out from the university. So I'd rather go to another infrastructure or go downtown than to build my own center. So I think finding ways of you do that. I mean, you can invite, people from the outside, of course. But if you do that, you also need to. In my fake critique session of the infrastructure clinic, the opponent or critique person says that, I've been invited. He's a corporate, or that person is a corporate person. Been invited to lots of things, but it hasn't really to humanities kind of context. But I haven't really felt that it was for real. So the way you actually do that and engage in projects, I think there are several models. I mean, here in urban humanities here at UCLA, with Todd Presner and others, the summer, as part of the program there, the kind of summer projects, you probably know what they were called, Francesca, perhaps. But they, working with communities in a kind of structured way with faculty and students and community members. But it's tricky too, and it takes, I think, being humble too. Universities aren't always humble. So when we were doing the Humane Infrastructures workshop, you read about homelessness on the UCLA website for the campaign, the big campaign they had. Homelessness was placed outside the university, and experts, this is the way I read it at least, experts from the university go out into the city, the world, and help. I don't think that's necessarily the best kind of model, especially when the university itself, when a portion of their students are homeless, too, So that's one reason why we wanted the executive vice chancellor who came to the workshop to stay for the homelessness kind of session. So because it's a real, problem, and it takes humility. Thank you.
Just say, please keep an eye on the dma.ucla.edu website and our social media for more of our talks that will be coming up. Do we have anything else in the fall scheduled? And the Discord, yes, and the Discord channel that we're trying to pump. And with that, I'd just really like to have everybody give another round of applause for Patrik Svensson, and our great thanks for coming in tonight and bringing all of this up. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. No, I will not.